outset as I'll say at the outset as I was putting this together and thinking about what to speak, I think this board does follow many of the best practices, and that's a credit to this board's leadership, also to Ken's leadership. And there were a couple of handouts included, which I think are reminders in many cases for practices that as a board we are also following, and then talk a little bit about when things go wrong and what are things as a board, particularly as we embark on a new sort of capital campaign, a new multi-year project to keep in mind as we head down that road. So governance context, I'll talk a fair bit about sort of hospital and the foundation and how they interrelate with each other. The hospital and the foundation, I'll say, start in the same place. They are independent corporations. They're not-for-profit organizations. They have a charitable status, and they are mission driven. I'll say the main difference in that respect is there are no shareholders. There is nobody who technically, I'll say, owns the assets of the corporation. They're not owned by the shareholders. They are, in a sense, I'll say, owned by the objects or the missions of the corporation. And the only thing that the assets within either the hospital or the foundation can be used for or can be expended for is to deliver on the objects or deliver on the missions of the corporation. So nobody owns them, and they always have to be, in a sense, used and managed with the objects of the corporation in mind. And then each is governed by a board of directors that has fiduciary duties, which I will spend a little bit of time next talking about. For those other lawyers on the board, this is a sort of going back to some of the things we learned in, I'll say, kind of law school 101. The law defines the director's duty as at the fiduciary level. The law also says, okay, the fiduciary standard or the fiduciary duty of care is the highest standard of conduct that as a society we impose on people, because as a director, we are in a position of trust to the members, to the objects, to the purposes of the corporation, and we are expected to act with the highest standards of ethical conduct towards those objects and towards the purposes of the organization. The duty is owed to the corporation, and I emphasize it's not to any one particular group or interest. We all come with our own background. We all come with our own, I'll say, understanding, our own preferences, our own biases, and our own way of looking at things. But as a fiduciary, we're to act in the best interest of the corporation and consider all of the interests and accountabilities of the corporation. And our duty is to act with the level of care, diligence, and skill that a reasonably prudent person, a reasonably competent person would exercise in these circumstances. Rules of fiduciary conduct boil down to a number of simple things. Number one, act in the best interests of the hospital, act in the best interests of the foundation. Act with honesty and good faith, always looking towards the purposes and objects of the organization. Be loyal in your duties of directors. Don't bring in outside interests. Don't bring outside biases to the table. Confidentiality is hugely important. Discussions that we have around the board table are confidential. They're meant to stay confidential. We should not be discussing or taking any of these out into the community. Obedience and board solidarity is a tough one. It means that when we have contentious issues come before the board, we should absolutely have lively debates. We should absolutely have controversy and discussion, and even dissension in the boardroom is entirely appropriate. But once a board decision is made, I'll say simply, we are all stuck with that decision, and we are all expected to show solidarity and support the collective decision that the board has made. And avoid a conflict of interest and duty. Our duty is to the corporation. If we have conflicts associated with our outside interests, we have to declare those. We have to make sure that we are not involved in the particular decision or issue where we have a conflict. And then all directors are expected to exercise a standard of care. And the interesting thing here, and as I phrased it in the first point on this slide, is Our standard of care is, in a sense, I'll say it's measured against the same benchmark, but each of our standards is going to be slightly different. As a lawyer, I'm expected to bring my legal skills. As an accountant, as a business person, you're expected to bring your accounting and your business skills to it. So your standard of care and my standard of care will probably be slightly different. They are measured against the same benchmark, but you have to bring your background knowledge, your background experience to it. A lot of board governance and a lot of our responsibilities, I'll say, are about process. Are we following proper process? We are not accountable for errors that are made where a proper process has been followed by the board. Have we had materials presented to us? Have we properly considered those materials? And have we come to a reasonable and supportable conclusion based on what's been provided to us? We are also entitled to rely on and trust in management unless there is something that has raised a flag or raised a concern for the board that there may be something that's not going on as it should. Again, not something that's ever occurred in this context, and we are entitled to rely on management, but we also have to keep our radar up and make sure that things are, are as they seem at a certain level. And defining the best interests of the corporation whoops, there's a hand up, Jamie. I can't necessarily.
Just a quick question here, because I had a question. It's just regarding the obedience bullet point you had there. Just because, and I've never had an issue on any boards I've been on, and I don't see an issue, but I've never seen obedience raised as a sort of a point like this. So the question is, what happens if obedience ever contravenes what we feel are our duties as directors? So let's say that I think I'm right and the rest of the board is wrong. Not that I go public and go to the news outlets, but there's I mean, ultimately we would have to have a way to say that, like, we don't think this is what should be done.
Yeah, and Jamie, I think what that means is, in the context of the discussions before the board, it's make sure that you express your opinion and make sure that your voice is heard. You'll see in the best practice documents that were handed out is sometimes it will even get to the stage where you say, okay, I'd like my dissenting voice noted in the minutes,
right,
as a specific issue. I think then ultimately, as a director, and it's respecting the loyalty and the confidentiality piece. If ultimately as a director we cannot agree with the direction that a corporation is going in, we register our dissent, we have it noted in the minutes of the meeting, and then ultimately we have to give very serious consideration to whether I can remain on the board in a circumstance where I fundamentally disagree. I still have to respect the confidentiality of the discussions. I still have to allow the corporation the board to take the corporation in the direction they've decided, but then I have to say, can I remain on the board?
Okay, I guess I just want clarity on that, because it's, I mean, public facing, obedience is one thing, as opposed to, going along with something that fundamentally somebody might have an issue with. So I just want to clarify, and you clarified it. Thank you very much.
No, and absolutely, public facing solidarity does not mean that everybody should not express their contrary opinions within the board discussions, and make sure that they are voiced and loudly heard. So defining the best interests is, I say, and for a foundation, it's look to the mission, the vision, and the values, both of the underlying hospital that we support and of the foundation itself, and then consider, and I'd like to spend a little bit of time on the accountabilities. And within a healthcare system and within a foundation, what do we have to think about for accountabilities? So accountability in the health system, or accountability for the hospital that we support, is a really complex thing. We think of our accountability, or a hospital's accountability, and fundamentally it is to the patients and the clients of the organization, the people that the hospital serves. But the hospital's accountability is incredibly complex. In addition to the direct patients that it serves, It has to provide for the healthcare needs of its community. It has to plan for the healthcare needs of its community. And those are some of the things we've heard in the presentations immediately before this. But then there are all sorts of other people that they are accountable to, whose interests have to be taken in mind anytime that a decision is made, anytime that assets or resources are expended. Other health service providers and Ontario Health Team. So the other organizations that combine with the hospital to provide care in the community. Responsibility to ministries, to the provincial government, and to our local government, to partners in the community. Huge responsibilities to our staff, our professional staff, our employed staff. And then accountability as a hospital also to the donors and volunteers. So a hospital's accountabilities, I'll say, are incredibly complex. And as a foundation, we have to keep those in mind. Flip over to the foundation accountability side, and I'll say the foundation accountability and our obligations as directors is actually a little bit easier. Our accountability map is a little bit simpler. We have primary accountabilities and primary responsibilities to the hospital that we serve and to the donors that provide money to us to allow us to serve the hospital. So it's a little bit easier accountability as a foundation director than I think it is as a hospital director. But also as a foundation director, I think we have to keep in mind, and we should keep in mind, the multiple accountabilities of the hospital that we serve, because that becomes, or that guides how we interact with the hospital, and I think it guides how we interact with our donors as well. So looking at hospital foundation relationships and how they relate to each other and how they interact with each other, ultimately, it's the hospital board that is accountable for the adequacy of the resources that are available to the hospital to provide for the needs of its communities and meet the hospital's accountabilities. Hospitals can fundraise directly. Hospitals do not need foundations. Probably up until it's probably 30, even 20, 30 years ago now, many hospitals fundraise directly. Most now do it through separate foundations. The shared mission is better healthcare or more effective, high quality healthcare for their community. Recognize that the foundation, while it is separate, exists, I'll say, exclusively to support the hospital. And most of our donors, many of our donors, are unaware that there is a separation in between the entities. They think of the foundation as simply a part of the hospital, and the gifts, while technically and legally are made to the foundation, in essence, people think they are donating to the hospital. And the foundation doesn't own the risk. The hospital, because it is accountable for the adequacy of its resources, the hospital owns the risk if the foundation doesn't do its job. And I think what all of this means is that while we are separate entities and we have to operate and be governed separately, we need incredibly strong alignment with the hospital and with the organization that we serve. Otherwise, we both do not achieve our missions. So why maintain separate fundraising corporations? I think if you go back historically, a large part of the reason that hospitals developed sort of separate foundations was concerns over the separation of sort of preserving a separation from, I'll say, operating dollars and keeping the I'll say excess funds or raised funds separate, in particular for liability purposes. Haven't really seen that become an issue in recent years. I think that's a lot of what gave rise to separate hospital foundations. But largely, I think the main advantages are in the separate and the focused mission that allows the hospital corporation to focus, or the hospital board to focus on the governance and operations of the hospital, and creates a separate and a dedicated and a unique corporation and a board that is focused on fundraising and assisting the hospital in achieving its objects. The main disadvantage is the risk of loss of alignment. And I'll talk about a few examples and cases that have hit the press and hit the media, and gone to the courts, and how those have played out. But that, I think, is the main disadvantage is the risk of loss of alignment. And through that, it's the foundation ceasing to meet the hospital's needs, and the hospital itself and its board of directors and its senior team not realizing the importance of fundraising and of participating in those goals and in that environment. So it has to be, there has to be a lot of work spent on maintaining alignment, and that's where the risks really come up of the two separate corporations. And at a bottom line, it comes back to hospitals and foundations have a shared objective. We have to work as partners with the hospital that we serve to achieve that mutual objective, to make sure that we're all rowing together in the same direction. And where this comes up, and I'll say I use a couple of examples here, and the examples are about 20 years old. But the interesting thing about these, and as I was preparing for this presentation, I looked up online. Tony Dagnone was a hospital CEO out of the London area. He wrote a report on a situation that happened at the Cambridge Hospital, where there was misalignment between the hospital and the hospital foundation. In this particular circumstance, the hospital was looking at embarking on a major capital or construction campaign. The foundation was more interested in looking at sort of what were some of the projects that its donors and volunteers were more interested in supporting. As I was researching and preparing for this presentation, I Googled, and there was actually a story. So this was 2003. There was actually a story in the local press in Cambridge that brought this up again in 2018. And the headline on the story was something like 20 years of waiting in Cambridge for a new hospital. And so notwithstanding that this happened and that this misalignment occurred in 2003, the community in Cambridge was still waiting for its new hospital 20 years later, and this was still a story. So understanding the roles, what Tony says in his report is the important interdependent relationship between the two organizations. They each have their own separate and individual responsibilities, but they have to work together as partners within the system, within their community, to achieve their mutual goals. And where misalignment occurs, it can have long-lasting and far-reaching implications for the hospital and the community. Excuse me, Blurview was another situation. This was actually a court decision. The hospital was embarking on a construction campaign. The foundation had excess funds invested. The hospital wished some of those excess funds to be expended on construction. The foundation said, no, our priority is more in the research realm. They went to court to sort this out. And I'll just simply say, as a, you think as a community member or as a taxpayer watching that spectacle unfold, where your donor dollars are now going to fund the lawyers for the foundation to argue with the lawyers for the hospital and have a judge decide what should happen to the funds of the foundation. And very clear message, and I've highlighted a couple of parts of this decision that sort of impact on the foundation. And in the end result in this case, the judge said, yes, the foundation is right. It's separate. It doesn't have to do what the hospital tells it, and doesn't have to necessarily make its decisions based exclusively on the hospital asks, we give. It is independent. But the foundation cannot, either at law or in equity, treat the considered requests made by the hospital as if they came from a stranger. The directors of the hospital are strategically placed to recognize the best interests of the patient and to advise the foundation of such interests. The failure of the foundation to give a demonstrable disinterest, thorough, and indeed sympathetic consideration to the request of the hospital may well be considered a breach of their duty. So it is appropriate for the foundation to make different decisions. It is independent. It is appropriate for the foundation to make different decisions than the directions of the hospital, but it has to give really, really serious consideration to those requests and those directions. And then how do you avoid this? Go back to the Cambridge report. You need to make sure that there is collaboration and a shared leadership model between the hospital board chair, the foundation board chair, the hospital CEO, and the foundation executive director or president. And I think within this organization and within Osler, between the hospital and the foundation, we do have that sort of leadership model and that sort of, I'll say, partnership and shared values and joint accountabilities. As a foundation director, what are the things that you are most, I'll say, supposed to pay attention to and supposed to be focusing on? I'll say there's 4 cornerstones for director due diligence. Number 1 is knowledge. This isn't for most of us, I'll say, what we do for a living, and some of these things are very, and some of the practices and some of the things we get involved in as directors are unknown to us from our professional or our personal lives. So the first one is knowledge. Make sure you take the time to, I'll say, read the materials that are provided to you to educate yourself on your roles and responsibilities as a director. Behavior and participation. Show up for meetings, it's participate in the discussions, it's be informed, and be knowledgeable and be prepared for the discussions of the board. Respect the roles, structures, and processes. Understand our roles as a director. Understand our responsibilities. Understand the parts of the structures we're supposed to participate in and the things that we're supposed to do. Understand a little bit about what the governance role is and what's the responsibility of management on the operations side, and make sure that we are respecting that divide. And then as a board and as individual directors, strive for continuous improvement, strive to educate ourselves, to improve the practices, to, I'll say, make better decisions day by day and as we move forwards. In the interest of time, there was a section in this presentation that had dealt with, I'll say, governance best practices. 2 excellent handouts that Anne had prepared while she was a partner at BLG and a member of this board, which I have included in the materials. I commend those to your reading as I went through them. And from my participation on this board over the last 18 months or so, I think many of these practices are already practices of this board, but I think really good short handouts to understand and help us each as directors better fulfill our role and our obligations to the corporation. And then a few things at the end and say, okay, where do things go wrong and where have things gone wrong in other situations for different hospitals and their foundations? The first thing, and I think that's a lesson out of those 2 cases that I described, Blurview Bloorview and Cambridge, is mistaking independent governance for independent mission. Is, yes, we are separate. Yes, we have separate accountabilities. Yes, we have separate responsibilities and things that we have to consider, but the mission of both organizations, the mission of the hospital and the mission of the foundation, are fundamentally the same, which is more and better healthcare for our community. And if we all, I say, focus on the mission as opposed to the independent governance, that's how you march forwards together towards the goal. And I think the challenge of those two cases, and when they spill over into the press and when they spill over into the courts and when they result in sort of supervisors being appointed to take over the governance of the hospital and the foundation, it's a lack of a dialogue between the hospital and the foundation. The operating entity doesn't understand the, I'll say, the challenges that the foundation faces, the particular resources or abilities of the community and the foundation to raise funds. And then on the other hand, it's the foundation feels it's treated as the, I'll say that, the lesser second cousin that's not really appreciated, that's told what to do, that is a servant of the hospital as opposed to a partner of the hospital. And it's two organizations that don't talk to each other. Second challenge for a foundation board is a board that defines itself exclusively as a governing board. I think for the hospital board, their role is more to govern the operating entity and make sure that the operating entity is making and meeting all of its accountabilities. For the foundation board, fundamentally, the purpose of the foundation is about fundraising, and therefore the purpose and mission of the foundation board is fundraising. We have to make sure that the foundation is properly governed, but we are a fundraising board and we are expected to contribute to that mission of the corporation. So it's a different focus. I'll say the hospital board can and should be a governing board and focused on the governance of the hospital. The foundation board has to be focused more appropriately on fundraising. And from that comes the issue of, okay, is as a board, what are some of the things that we need to do? And I'd say the next place where things can go wrong is failing to own board recruitment. That is fundamentally a job of the board. Yes, it is a job of the CEO of the foundation as well, but it is fundamentally a responsibility of the board to own board recruitment and be part of that process for continuity and for succession within the board. And as a board, and I'll say this is one of the challenges, and as you think of some of the discussions and the questions we've had to this point in the retreat, sometimes the board will and should get involved in the minutia, and we want to understand the programs we're supporting. We want to understand how they impact on us, how they impact on our family, how they impact on our friends. And many of the questions that we all asked in the different presentations sort of start to get into the minutia. But recognize that as a board, we can't delve too deeply into some of those minutia. We have to think about and focus on our goal, making sure that we're sort of focused on the major things, focused on the big ticket items, making sure that we're asking the management, we're asking Ken and his team the right questions, that we're focused on the big ticket items, the things that are going to cause the foundation to fail, and making sure that we're marching step by step towards our objectives, and asking management the right questions, and not asking the wrong questions, or not expecting management to provide things to us that we really don't need and that really don't go towards the ultimate goal. And engagement and relationship building is recognized as a board role and a board accountability. And I'll say, go back to the accountability slide. As a foundation, we have essentially two accountabilities, to the hospital and to our donors. And it is the board's job and it is the board's accountability to build those relationships. That's not strictly the job of Ken and his management team. That is a responsibility of the board. And if we do not do that appropriately, we start to lose opportunities. We lose opportunities to understand and therefore better support the hospital that we serve, and we lose opportunities with donors in conveying the message of the hospital. And it's things like, and in thinking about that, the presentations that we just have, those help us better understand and better build relationships with the hospital, and hopefully take that message out to our community, and I'll say better sell and better fundraise on behalf of the hospital. And then finally, I'll say it's failing to build relationships of trust and cohesion in the foundation board. And I know that this has been tough for me as a director. I have literally met none of my fellow directors in person. I'm not seeing all of the faces on the side of my screen, but Ken is there and he's kind of laughing at that. But for new directors, it's tough. We haven't met each other. To Jamie's question, and we haven't had that issue in my time on the board, but we have to be able to, in a relationship of trust, respectfully disagree with each other and be able to have difficult conversations, because difficult conversations will come, but still at the end respect the decision that the board makes and all work towards that goal and towards that outcome. Hopefully this will end soon, and hopefully we will all be able to participate in meetings in person sometime in the near future, but we're not, at least at this stage, we're not really in control of that. So I hope that's been helpful. I will stop sharing. If there are further questions, I'm happy to take questions. If there's time, or I turn that over to Ken.
A wonderful overview, Patrick, of the things that we need to be mindful of, and understanding that, as you say, the role of the hospital versus the role of the foundation, and how working together is critical to moving both missions forward. So, great overview. Thank you. Any questions at this stage for Patrick? No.
Just thinking, Bob, if I can, just off your comments, and just thinking about when a new director comes in. I know these events are recorded. Patrick's presentation would be a great thing if we don't already, to give to a new director when he joins the board, just as part of the indoctrination to the role and what they're doing. So I've been on this for a while, and I've never heard some of this detail, so I thought it was excellent. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and some of this, John, and I know many of us will have, I'll just say, different affiliations and different boards and different community organizations that we're involved in. Some of this is basic governance and how you function as, or how you should act as a director on any corporation. The other part of it, and it is a special and unique relationship, whereas a foundation, we are separate and independent, but we exist to serve the needs of the hospital and the needs of its patients. And it's really trying to say, okay, how do we function separately and independently, but working together in a way that I'll say best takes the hospital and the foundation forwards.
Excellent.
Good. Any other questions about this? No. All right. Well, it's, I guess, a sign of being thorough in the presentation. Thank you very much, Patrick, again, for sharing that with us, and I think John's point is a very good one. It almost needs to be part of the orientation for new directors to hear this. So thank you. I'm going to juggle the agenda just slightly. We were planning to have Ken